Hello, this is Todd Luck, and it doesn't age well. It's not a term I use often, but sometimes something comes out that at the time it was released was pretty good, but later is replaced by something that does the same thing but better. And I think that's what we're looking at in this particular video. This is a review of the Tarzan comic strip preserves released by Blackthrone Publishing back in the 1980s. This was a 4-issue miniseries reprinting old Tarzan comic strips. Now, to my knowledge, the only new comic books that were produced in America of Tarzan was this one adaptation of half of Tarzan of the Apes that was put out by Marvel Comics around the time that Greystoke came out, that was published as a Marvel Super Special and was also printed as a 2-part miniseries. But this lesser-known miniseries by Blackthrone also came out in the 80s, and Blackthrone did a lot of comic strip reprints, and this was, of course, their reprints of Tarzan. Now, just for a little bit of background, the Tarzan comic strip had been going since 1929. It literally predated the invention of comic books. And so it started out with these pictures and this text that you see here. It was originally drawn by Hal Foster. And of course, the strip would transition to a more traditional comic look, and it would run with new material on the dailies until 1972 and new material on the Sundays until 2002. And it would have reprints in newspapers up until 2021. However, the strip does continue today with the online subscription service available on EdgarRiceBurroughs.com and is quite excellent. It's currently written by Roy Thomas. And so this is a comic strip with a very storied history, which was worked on by some of the luminaries of the comic book medium. And so each issue of this miniseries contains 72 pages of strips, and this miniseries will take you through different eras of the comic strip that ran over several decades. So first, I want to talk about the substance of what's contained in these issues, and then I want to talk about the presentation of the time that these came out, and also some other options that are now available to read these strips. So our first couple issues are going to be by Burne, Hogarth, and they're going to be strips from the 1940s. And so each issue contains a cover and back cover that's essentially just a blown up panel. And so I don't think this is necessarily the best representation of Hogarth's work on the front here. And then on the back of the first issue, we have Tarzan and his big old jungle booty. I think the second issue's covers are a bit better. So this is Tarzan and the Barbarians, which is one of the several stories contained in this issue. And I think it looks pretty cool. It is a very tiny panel that is blown up, but it's amazing amount of detail. And then this on the back just looks really awesome. More Barbarians, and I just love the colors here. It looks really good. And so Hogarth is producing this in the Golden Age, so there is very dense storytelling with a lot of panels, but Hogarth puts a ton of detail in them, and it looks gorgeous. And so the stories are a little bit mundane for Tarzan, a little bit run-of-the-mill. They involve him getting into conflicts with a lot of Arab kingdoms that he's running into, and then, you know, he'll bump into lost civilizations, Amazons and barbarians. He's just going from one conflict in a lost civilization to another. But it's all solidly done, and it feels like a good movie serial. And, you know, if this was a black and white serial, I would absolutely watch it. So the third issue takes us to the 1970s with strips by Russ Manning. And so the cover here is solid. Now, there's a lot of fantastic stuff in here, so him fighting lions seems kind of ordinary, but it works. It's him and Jodhpur versus a bunch of lions. And then the back cover shows how beaten up they are after they survive that encounter. Russ Manning is one of my favorite creators. I first discovered him in reprints of his incredible 1960s comic Magnus Robot Fighter. But in these strips from the 70s, he's an even more refined creator. And his layouts are amazing. His stories are epic and absolutely feel like a Burroughs novel you just haven't read yet. I actually had to check to see if he was adapting a novel the first time I read one of his comic strips because they were that spot on. His stuff is just absolutely spectacular, absolutely epic. There's one story set in Paladon, the prehistoric valley, which is amazing. And then there's also his take on the dead moon of Pellucidar. It's a fantastic collection of stories. And so the last issue features two artists. One is Gil Kane, who for some reason they thought this was a good representation of his artwork. This panel is way too blowed up. There were better representations inside, which you'll see. And our other artist is featured on the back, and it is none other than the legendary Mike Grell, and this image looks awesome. And so I've got some Gil Kane comics here and there, but I never knew he worked on Tarzan, and I have never seen him produce better artwork than what I see in these strips. The jungle just looks amazing. The writing is by Archie Goodwin, and this is just straight jungle adventures set in the 1980s. And so there's a kid who gets lost in the jungle. There's a woman who is on the run from her jealous ex-husband in the jungle. And so in the hands of any other creative team, these stories could be extremely boring and mundane. But I got to tell you, Archie Goodwin makes them extremely engaging, extremely exciting. And Gil Kane's artwork just knocks it out of the ballpark. I was so surprised at how much I enjoyed these strips. And then there's Mike Grell, who did Warlock, he did Green Arrow, and of course he created Sable, who had a TV series, who I think I'm the only person who remembers it. And he does some amazing artwork on the Tarzan strips. It's very realistic, very detailed stuff. It looks great. Now, the stories I found a little less engaging than Archie Goodwin or Russ Manning, but I will say that I thought his last story in here, where Tarzan deals with a Cold War conflict in the jungle that could set off World War III, was very interesting and very clever, and I did like that. Now, there's 72 pages of content in each issue, and the first issue does have a few pages as a foreword at the beginning that is this excerpt from a longer essay about Burne Hogarth. If you want to read a longer version of that essay, it is contained in his Tarzan of the Apes hardcover that was printed in the 1970s. Each issue also contains a 2-page biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs that is printed on the inside covers, and each issue contains the same biography on the inside covers of Burroughs. All right, so taking our way back machine to the 1980s when this was printed, this was pretty exciting stuff to be able to get a hold of these old comic strips. We didn't have the internet back then. You couldn't just Google it and find it on a website. Back then, you would see comic strips reprinted in a couple different ways. One was the way DC did it back during their run on Tarzan in the 1970s. And basically, they just cut up the strips and reformatted them into a comic book page. And sometimes it was done badly, sometimes it was done well, but even in its best case scenario, you were altering the artist's original layout and diminishing it in some way. And so that was one way to do it. Another way was the way that Tarzan the Lost Adventure reprinted the John Carter strip. And these are just straight reprints of the comic strip. And unfortunately, though, they are much smaller than they would have appeared in a newspaper, but still legible at this size. Just as a friendly reminder, this is what a newspaper looks like. This is it folded in half. This is actually a paper I used to work at because I used to be a journalist and graphic designer. And so you'll notice that this is a lot smaller than this. However, I will say that I was able to read all of it, and I do enjoy the artwork, though I do infinitely wish that it was bigger. Now, you'll also notice that these are Sunday strips that are collected in this miniseries. And so Hogarths are a completely different format than the Sunday strips that we're probably used to, right? And so how did they deal with this when they got to issue 3 with Russ Manning strips in the 1970s? They decided to cram 2 strips in each page. This is entirely too small, especially for Russ Manning's amazing layouts. However, I will say I was still able to enjoy Manning's work, even though I really wish it had been bigger here. It's also a shame that they're printed in black and white instead of color. Sunday strips have color in them, and at times that helps make it easier to read. But then an amazing thing happens on the 4th issue. They reprint each strip as a full page, and it works absolutely beautifully. I wish they had done this with Russ Manning, but I am so glad to see this done with Kane and Mike Grell. So back in the day, I would imagine that even with the size issues and them being in black and white, this was going to be the only game in town as far as reprinting these strips. But my friends, we live in modern times, and printing is cheap and it's easy, and everybody can print a comic book, so everybody does print a comic book, and that includes reprinting old material. And so there are tons of comic strips now available in different collections. Those original Tarzan comic strips I showed you by Hal Foster, they're printed in this bad boy by the Library of American Comics Essentials. And they are reprinted in an infinitely readable and enjoyable full-sized format. And the same is true of the later strips as well. This is a collection of Russ Manning strips that I just got. You've got your black and white daily strips in the front and your color Sunday strips in the back. All of it is nice and big and easy to read. And so there are collections like that with what I believe are probably the whole run of Burne Hogarth, Russ Manning, Kane, but unfortunately I cannot find any collections of Mike Grell's strips. However, the great thing is that fans have put all of the comic strips online to read for free on ERB Zine, so look that up if you're looking to read any of this stuff. You want to try it out before buying it, or there's something you can't find, or it's out of your price range. It's a great way to read them. So where does that leave our comic strip preserves? So nowadays, yes, there are better ways to consume these strips for the most part. You know, Mike Grell's being the exception, but I will say that there is something very interesting about going back and seeing how they were reprinted in the past. It is a piece of history. It is a collectible. If you're a completist, you might want to pick them up. And, you know, if you can find them for cheap, you know, and you don't mind the size, they are a way to sample these strips, you know, and see what that run was like. And again, if you're looking for modern Tarzan comic strips, go on edgarriceburroughs.com and subscribe to their comic strip service. It's like $22 a year, and you get a ton of different strips based on every Burroughs property you can think of. Everything from John Carter of Mars, At the Earth's Core, Land That Time Forgot, Monster Men, just everything you can think of, and a whole bunch of stuff you can't. All right, guys, that's it. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.